May 16, 1943, sunset bleeding off the edges of Lincolnshire as engines coughed to life at RAF Scampton. At 21:39, the first 3 of 19 Avro Lancasters began their roll, each slung with a strange barrel beneath the belly. Upkeep, turning the aircraft into what Guy Gibson joked looked like a pregnant duck. The perimeter hedge rushed toward them, wheels biting the runway, Merlins howling as the heavy bombers clawed into the thin gold of evening and barely cleared the field. Ground crews vanished to specks, the air filled with the steady tremor of 4-engine resolve. This wasn't a normal raid, and every man aboard knew it. Low level, at night, through flak and wires, to hit a wall of stone with a weapon that was supposed to skip like a stone over water. The Ruhr's dams were the target, the industrial heart the purpose, but the question hanging in every intercom pause was simpler. Can a handful of crews bend the course of a war in a single night? The North Sea waited, black and flat, and the bomb aimers checked their crude wooden sights one more time as England fell behind. Spring heat had clung to England all day, but inside the Air Ministry, pressure simmered far hotter. Intelligence officers had traced Germany's strength not just to its ironworks and coal seams, but to water, controlled, stored, and unleashed through a network of massive reservoirs powering the Ruhr. Over 45 key industrial plants relied on these dams. The region produced nearly 60% of the Third Reich's steel and war machinery. Breach just 2, Möhne and Eder, and tens of millions of cubic meters of water would roar down the valleys, obliterating bridges, drowning roads, and silencing turbines. But theory clashed with fear. The weapon was unproven, the flight path suicidal, and 133 airmen were being asked to fly 19 Lancasters at 60 feet at night across enemy-defended terrain. Critics called it reckless. Visionaries called it necessary. And in war, destiny favors the bold, not the safe. While most of Britain slept through blackout nights and rationed hope, one man paced his drawing board long after midnight. Barnes Wallis, 54 years old, bespectacled, polite, and stubborn as steel rivets, had become obsessed with a single idea. If Britain couldn't destroy Germany's factories, it would destroy the water that fed them. A marine engineer turned aviation pioneer, Wallis tested concept after concept: torpedoes, timed charges, deep penetration bombs, only to watch each theory sink under physics and aircraft limits. But defeat had never built a bridge, and Wallis was a man who built things. In a tank at Teddington, then along the lonely shingle of Chesil Beach, he chased a dream that looked absurd. A spinning cylinder that would skip like a stone across water, strike a dam's face, sink, and detonate at depth. Tests shattered steel casings, ripped apart prototypes, and even damaged aircraft. But one trial changed everything. A cylinder bouncing more than 20 times, skimming for over 1,300 yards. It wasn't elegance, it was proof. A weapon that shouldn't exist suddenly did. Britain had a blade. Now it needed someone willing to swing it. Proving the weapon could work was one battle. Convincing the air staff was another war. Wallis sent his report titled Air Attack on Dams, arguing that a 6,500-pound charge detonated against a dam wall 30 feet underwater could fracture even Germany's mightiest barriers. But Bomber Command's chief, Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, wanted no part of it. He was already losing crews at a brutal rate and saw this plan as a fantasy. "This is tripe of the wildest description," he wrote, dismissing the bouncing bomb as a distraction. Senior officers pressured Wallis's own company, Vickers Armstrong, to silence him. One executive even snapped, "Drop this silly nonsense about dams." Yet science is stubborn. Wallis had allies, Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal among them, and Portal overruled the doubters. He not only approved trials, he set a deadline: spring 1943, when reservoirs would be at their highest. That mandate left barely weeks to finalize a weapon that barely had a blueprint. But urgency cuts sharper than doubt. 3 Lancaster bombers were assigned for live trials, and in the cold mud at Reculver, under strict secrecy, crews watched steel cylinders smash and shatter until one bounced true. The skeptics hadn't vanished. The clock hadn't slowed, but the mission had a green light, and in war, that is enough. With approval secured, the race against time became a sprint no engineer envied. The weapon, codenamed Upkeep, took shape not as a sleek bomb, but as a hulking steel cylinder 7.5 feet wide, braced with wooden struts and packed with 6,600 pounds of Torpex, the same explosive that shattered U-boats. It looked less like a tool of war and more like a rolling beer barrel filled with thunder. To make it skip, mechanics fitted a special gear to spin it to 500 revolutions per minute backwards before release, so the weapon would race forward, hit the surface, bounce toward the dam, then sink tight against the masonry before its hydrostatic fuses triggered under pressure. But the bomb was only half the miracle. The aircraft needed to be reinvented too. Lancaster B-3s had their bomb bay doors ripped away, and even their front turrets removed to shave weight. The cradles holding Upkeep were bolted directly beneath the belly, transforming the bomber into a machine designed for one mission, one night, and one outcome. Early tests at Reculver were brutal. Cylinders shattered on impact, elevators on test, Lancasters bent under the violent bounce, and pilots returned shaken by the shockwaves rolling up their wings. Yet each failure sharpened the idea. Wallis insisted the drop height must be lowered from 150 feet to just 60, and the speed fixed near 220 miles per hour, a realm where error meant catastrophe. Workshops hammered, engines roared through the dusk at Scampton, and men who had flown over Berlin, Hamburg, and Essen now practiced for a target stranger and deadlier than any city. The weapon was unproven, dangerous, and temperamental. But by May 13, 1943, the final bombs were declared sufficiently robust. In war, sometimes sufficient is the closest thing to certainty anyone will ever get. On March 17, 1943, the Air Ministry stitched together a unit that would become less a squadron and more a single-purpose instrument of war, Squadron X. It was assembled from men who had already seen too much and yet still stepped forward. Veterans, volunteers, and a scattering of faces from across the Commonwealth. Of the 133 airmen chosen to take part, 89 were British, 28 Canadian, 13 Australian, 2 New Zealanders, and 1 American, a patchwork of experience and nerves. Wing Commander Guy Penrose Gibson, short, stocky, and uncommonly driven, was named to lead. He arrived with a combat record that read like a roadmap of the bomber war. Dozens of sorties in Hamptons, nearly 100 in Beaufighters, and the hard lessons of the Manchester and the Lancaster already written into his hands. Gibson, charismatic, blunt, sometimes called cocky, was exactly the sort of commander who could take risky theory and make it feel like a plan. Crews came from established units. 3 full crews transferred from 97 Squadron, one led by Flight Lieutenant Joseph C. McCarthy, the American-born Brooklynite who had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1939 and crossed the ocean to fight. Pilot Officer L.G. Knight and his Australian companions came from 50 Squadron. Sergeant R. Kello, the Australian wireless operator, remembered the offer as simple and irresistible. Interesting, he said, and with faith in each other, they signed on. By March 24th, the ad hoc group was operational. 3 days later, Squadron X shed its secretive tag and was christened Number 617 Squadron, a name that would soon be written into history, stamped in loss, and carried afterward as quiet, heavy pride. Training did not begin with maps or tactics, it began with altitude. Not the icy heights at which bomber crews usually survived, but the lethal height of 60 feet, lower than a church steeple, lower than treetops, low enough to smell the river spray and feel the ground skim beneath the bomb bay. Gibson drove his men hard. They flew across Britain at treetop level, racing over hedgerows, threading valleys, and skimming canal tops from Lincolnshire to the Lake District and north into Scotland. Navigation became an art of inches, not miles. Bomb aimers practiced using a crude wooden triangular sight with 2 nails, lining up towers at reservoirs to mimic dam walls. At night, the danger multiplied. To measure height in darkness, crews relied on 2 angled spotlights beneath the wings. When the beams met on the water's surface, the Lancaster was at exactly 60 feet. Too high, and the bomb would bounce wildly. too low, and the bomber would kiss the surface and never rise again. The first practice runs startled villagers near Ibrook Reservoir as wooden canvas towers stood in for the Möhne's flak towers. Purple flares marked training drops as Lancasters roared overhead. At the quieter Aberton Reservoir near Colchester, pilots rehearsed the treacherous run that would mirror the Edar's steep, winding valley. Every day, confidence grew. By the end of April, crews could navigate low at night, pinpoint landmarks at speed, and time practice drops to seconds. Every night, nerves sharpened. No one had ever flown a mission like this, and no second chances would come. Yet amid the grind and the roar, belief formed. The men of 617 Squadron would not simply try this mission, they would make it work. On May 14th and 15, final rehearsals rolled across the reservoirs. Flares rising, aircraft pulling high after simulated impact, water rippling below. It was completely successful, Gibson wrote, and in less than 48 hours, practice would give way to war. On May 16th, secrecy lifted like a curtain, and every man in the packed briefing hall finally heard what his training had been preparing him for. The targets were not cities or factories, but the great dams of Germany, the Möhne, the Eder, the Sorpe, and 3 secondary reservoirs feeding the Ruhr Valley. Large models stood at the front of the room, their towers marked, their spillways outlined, their valleys traced with flood paths. Guy Gibson spoke first, calm, precise, commanding. "We are going to attack the great dams," he told them. Then came the challenge. If they failed tonight, they would return tomorrow. There was no alternative plan, no second squadron waiting in reserve. Success was the mission. And if not success, then insistence. Barnes Wallis stepped forward, the mind behind the weapon now facing those who would carry it. He outlined the approach angles, the release distances, 425 to 475 yards from the wall, the speed and height, the tower positions, and the flak nests. Air Vice Marshal Cochrane followed, demanding total secrecy. The weapon might be used again elsewhere, and not a word about upkeep could leave the room. Some airmen hid their nerves, others stared fixedly ahead, but all felt the weight of history on their shoulders. Rear gunners visualized First World War-style strafing runs over water. Navigators checked final maps. Engineers rehearsed throttle settings for hair-width altitude control. One detail sobered the room more than any speech: 19 aircraft, but only 3 primary targets. All must be hit, and some would not come back. The crews ate their evening meals quietly. Outside, ground staff secured the huge cylindrical bombs, locking them beneath the Lancasters' bellies. Some airmen saw Upkeep up close for the first time, a steel giant waiting to spin into legend. Sunset bled across the runway. Engines rumbled in the distance. Soon, the final signal arrived. Execute Operation Chastise, 0 hour 22:48. And without fanfare, men rose from their chairs, jackets buttoned, and walked into the night to board aircraft built for this one moment. They cut across the North Sea under a thin, cold moon. 19 Lancasters threaded into a night that was never meant to be friendly. Strong winds had already robbed the first formation of their timing and steadiness. Instead of the planned Scheldt landfall, they found themselves over Walcheren, fringed with searchlights and waiting guns. At such low altitude, navigation was ruthless. A single misplot, one wrong drift, and miles of dead sky could open beneath you. Gibson briefly climbed to 300 feet to give his navigator a clearer fix. The bomb aimers hunched over roller maps, tracing canals and rail junctions until their fingers cramped. They met flak barges on the Wilhelmina Canal and felt the first staccato rattle of enemy fire, but none took mortal damage. Yet. Hopgood's AJM would not be so lucky later. Light flak nicked a port wing as he threaded toward the reservoir. The turning point that mattered was the tree-line rise above Aalen. AJG, Gibson's Lancaster, punched through and below it. The moonlit Möhne spread like a silver wound. Other crews arrived ragged and alone. Young's flight, which had taken off at 21:47, slipped in singly and reported at 00:26, each pilot threading a narrow corridor of beams and shadow. The third wave, delayed from 2159, paid the price. AJB, flown by Flight Lieutenant W. Astle, was caught in a deadly crossfire, burst into flames, and struck the Earth in a flash that every other crew would remember as a warning. In those final miles, the men condensed everything they had learned: spotlight geometry, sighting nails, the feel of 60 feet into a single, fatal minute. There was no ceremony on approach, only the hush of men doing what practice had carved into them: steady hands, sealed lips, and the hard, quiet will to press on. They found the Möhne under a hard, indifferent moon, and the dam answered them with searchlights and the staccato rattle of flak. Gibson circled once, twice. "I'm going to look the place over," he told his crews, and then took AJG in to draw fire and measure the scars. The first successful strike came from Flight Lieutenant DJ Shannon in AJL. At 12:28 a.m., his Upkeep bounced across the black water 3 times and detonated against the masonry in a spray of light and water, but from the air, the wall stubbornly held. Hopgood's AJM followed, only to be hit as it crossed the crest. Its bomb landed past the parapet, and the Lancaster broke into flames. Some men leapt free into the night, others did not. Gibson kept pressing, weaving to distract the gunners, while Martin in AJP took his run at 12:38 a.m., his cylinder veering but striking the bank and exploding with a shock that sent birds of water high into the air. Young's attack came next. His Upkeep bounced true, and even before the valley could show the full consequence, Gibson sensed the change, stone and mortar beginning to loosen. Then, Maltby in AJJ broke the dam. He let his bomb go, watched it ricochet, and saw the parapet give way. Water hit the sky like columns of smashed silver and mud, hurled 1,000 feet up, and the Möhne's placid face turned to ruin. For a breathless moment, the crews above watched the valley rearrange itself. At 12:56 a.m., Gibson sent the single word that would travel back to Scampton and into history: success. And the first piece of Germany's waterwork heart had fallen. The Eder Valley should have been a quiet salvation. No flak guns, no towers bristling with cannon, no enemy searchlights cutting the sky. But nature had built its own fortress there. Steep, wooded hills pressed tight around the reservoir, leaving only a twisting, treacherous descent before a sudden, narrow run at the dam. Finding it in the dark cost time. Mist clung low over the water, and even veteran navigators doubted their charts. Gibson arrived first, then Young, both out of bombs, both circling above like lone shepherds guiding the others in. Below them, the valley lay still, deceptively peaceful, a silver mirror cupped inside black ridges. Shannon and AJL tried first. 3 passes, engines straining, the Lancaster diving sharply then clawing back up to avoid the rising hills. No release. Maudsley in AJZ followed with the same struggle. Twice he lined up, twice he was forced to abort. Finally, on his 3rd attempt, Shannon found the line. His Upkeep struck the water, bounced twice, slammed the dam. A thunderous white plume, but the wall remained. Maudsley came again. His bomb was late, smashing the parapet with a violent flash. AJZ banked steep and disappeared into the dark. Crews above saw nothing more and feared the worst. Then came AJN, flown by Pilot Officer Les Knight. He brought his Lancaster down with perfect menace, wings almost brushing the hillsides, the reservoir rushing up like a black blade. One clean run, release, 3 skips across moonlit water, and then the dam broke as if punched by a giant hand. Masonry buckled, water surged, and in an instant the Eder exploded outward, a roaring tidal column ripping into the valley below. At 01:54, Gibson radioed the code word dinghy. Second success confirmed. In the silence that followed, the crews understood the truth. This night was no longer an experiment. It was working, and it was costing them dearly. The Ruhr's arteries were beginning to tear, one wall of water at a time. While the Möhne and Eder had fallen to shock waves and spinning steel, the Sorpe waited in stubborn quiet, an entirely different beast. An earthen embankment with a concrete core could not be shattered by ricochet. To bring it down would require a bomber to fly along the crown of the dam itself, keeping a single outer engine aligned with the ridge, and drop Upkeep so it rolled down the sloped wall before exploding deep below the surface. Precision, patience, and nerve, none of which could be borrowed from another crew. The second wave reached the target in fragments. Flight Lieutenant Barlow's AJE went down near Haldern. Monroe's AJW limped home shot through, radios dead, and the rear turret powerless. Byers' AJK vanished near Texel, likely claimed by flak. Rice's AJH lost its bomb when the crew misread altitude over water. What arrived at Sorpe was not a formation, but a single machine, AJT, flown by American-born Joe McCarthy, the lone pilot of his wave to survive the gauntlet and reach the target intact. His Lancaster had been switched last minute due to a coolant leak, lacking even a VHF radio, but McCarthy pressed in regardless. 10 times he lined up. 10 times he forced the huge bomber along the narrow crest, throttles trembling, altitude held by instinct and sweat. Finally, the bomb aimer called it release. Upkeep dropped, rolled, sank, and detonated beneath the dam's skin. For a moment in the moonlit spray, the aircrew dared to imagine the Sorpe giving way. But the wall only shuddered and settled back into silence. Scarred, wounded, but standing. McCarthy circled, hoping the slow pressure of water might finish what the explosion had begun. It did not. He turned for home at 01 AAC, his crew exhausted yet unbroken, knowing they had come as close as any living pilot ever would to toppling that immovable barrier. Sorpe had not fallen, but neither had the spirits of the men who challenged it. The night was not finished, and others still waited to try. Behind the first two waves came the final 5 Lancasters, the mobile reserve, a shadow blade held in silence until word arrived from 5 Group. When the signals crackled through, confirming the Möhne and Eder breaches, their task shifted. Strike whatever remained, turn pressure into collapse. But by the time they crossed the Dutch coast, night had grown sharp and defenses fully awakened. Pilot Officer Otley in AJC was the first to fall, coned by searchlights near the shore, ripped by flak and blown apart in a single detonation that lit the sea like false dawn. Only one man from his crew survived, hurled clear by the explosion. Moments later, AJS, flown by Pilot Officer Burpee, met the same fate over the Luftwaffe base at Gilze Rhein. A streak of flame plunging into the dark, bomb erupting on impact. Flight Sergeant Brown in AJF pressed deeper, flying so low he once followed a road below the treetops. Through mist and shadows, he reached the Sorpe and dropped his weapon at 0314, the cylinder rolling down the embankment and erupting in white spray. A strike that carved scars into concrete but could not collapse the giant. Townsend in AJO clawed his way toward the Enipe instead. He nearly stalled on takeoff, burst through the airfield hedge, then fought flak, fog, and an oil pressure failure that forced him to shut down one engine. 4 runs over the targeted reservoir. 4 failed release windows. On the 5th, the bomb aimer let go only to watch the weapon fall just short of the dam wall. Last in the sky came AJY, hunted by night fighters, rear turret dead, engine laboring as dawn crept up behind him. Ordered first to the Diemel, then redirected to the Sorpe, he searched until light betrayed the dark. Unable to locate his target in rising haze and with defense networks fully awake, he turned for home, carrying one of the only upkeeps never dropped. By the time the final wheels touched Scampton grass, the sun had arrived, pale, indifferent, untroubled by the cost written across empty dispersal bays. 8 Lancasters gone. 56 men lost. The mission was not yet judged nor mourned, only paid for in full by night's last wave. By sunrise, reconnaissance Spitfires were already carving contrails above Germany, cameras whirring over shattered masonry and boiling rivers. The photographs that returned to England defied caution and expectation. The Möhne Dam's breach stretched roughly 250 feet wide and 72 feet deep. Its reservoir drained by 116 million cubic meters of water in just 12 hours. the flood carved its way through villages and valleys, sweeping aside bridges, roads, power stations, pumping stations, and industrial plants with the same ruthless certainty as artillery. In the Ruhr Valley alone, 11 factories were destroyed and more than 100 others damaged, along with 25 bridges and key water and gas facilities. The Eder told the same grim story, a 230-foot gap, a rolling surge tearing past riverbanks and flattening farmland that would not be cultivated again for years. German civilian losses were tragic. More than 1,000 lives claimed in the torrent, many of them forced laborers sleeping in camps downstream, crushed beneath collapsing barracks as the night turned to chaos. For all its precision, war remains indifferent to who stands beneath falling walls. Yet even amid grief and wreckage, one truth emerged clearly. The Reich felt this blow. 30,000 workers were immediately diverted to dam repairs, and men pulled away from coastal defenses and critical armament projects. Anti-aircraft batteries that once guarded factories and harbors were uprooted to ring the surviving dams. And deep inside his headquarters, Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, flew over the devastation and admitted the truth. The Ruhr water supply was imperiled. Industry at risk of standstill. Hitler raged, demanding explanations from Göring. How had just 19 British aircraft breached the walls of his industrial empire? But rage did not reverse rivers. The dams that fed the beating steel heart of Germany had been struck like arteries, and for a moment, however brief, the Third Reich felt its lifeblood weaken. The water receded, the ruins steamed, and the world understood that ingenuity, sacrifice, and precision had turned a theory into a weapon and a night mission into a shockwave across a continent. The cost was terrible. The achievement is undeniable. And as the morning haze lifted from the valleys, the impact of Operation Chastise was no longer a plan. It was history, written in stone and flood. At RAF Scampton, dawn brought neither celebration nor silence, only a heavy suspended breath. Ground crews counted aircraft spaces like tombstones. Commanders read casualty lists with fists tight behind their backs. 8 Lancasters gone. 56 men never returned. Yet when word of the breaches arrived in full, the air station shifted from dread to stunned pride. Within hours, honors were already being prepared. Wing Commander Guy Gibson received the Victoria Cross for leadership under fire. 5 airmen earned the Distinguished Service Order, 14 the Distinguished Flying Cross, 12 the Distinguished Flying Medal, and the lone American aviator on the raid, Joe McCarthy, was awarded the DSO as well. On May 28, 1943, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth walked among the weary crews at Scampton, shaking hands, offering quiet words, pausing at empty places where men should have stood. There were no brass bands, no thunderous speeches. These aviators had flown a mission that was both miracle and gambit, a triumph forged through mathematics, nerve, and the brutal gamble of low-level night flying. Newspapers hailed them as Dambusters before black armbands had even been folded. The public saw heroes, but those within the squadron saw the cost first. Gibson himself would speak humbly of the men he led, but he carried their absence like ballast. Even in triumph, there was no illusion of simple victory. The dams would be rebuilt. The war still raged on every front, but 617 Squadron had proven something the world had rarely witnessed. That invention could be as powerful as artillery. That courage could fly lower than fear, and that a small band of volunteers could strike the most guarded heart of an empire. Before that night, 617 Squadron was just a number. After it, the number itself became a legend. And for the men who survived, there was no chest-thumping, no revelry, only the solemn pride of those who did what others said could not be done, and paid for it in midnight flame and floodwater. History rarely crowns a single mission as decisive, and this one was no exception. The dams did not end the war. Factories roared again, steel poured, and the Reich continued to fight with iron teeth bared. Yet something fundamental shifted on that May night. Operation Chastise proved that imagination could pierce fortresses where brute force failed. It forced Germany to pull tens of thousands of men, guns, and labor hours away from its war machine. It lifted British morale in a year starved for light. And it forged 6th-17 Squadron into a weapon of precision that would one day drop the Tallboy and Grand Slam. Earthquake bombs that cracked U-boat pens and shattered viaducts others believed untouchable. The raid became more than a mission. It became a doctrine. Sometimes victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the ones who dare to think differently, fly lower, and risk all on a razor's edge of possibility. When the waters settled and the wreckage dried, families grieved, towns rebuilt. The dams rose again, stronger than before, yet generation after generation still looks back at that singular night, not for the destruction, but for the audacity. 19 bombers against an empire's lifeblood. Engineers who refused to accept impossible. Air crews who flew into gunfire at treetop height with a weapon that might not work. Some returned in silence. Others never returned at all. Ask veterans of 617 Squadron what they remember, and they do not speak first of medals or headlines. They speak of empty places at breakfast tables, of names etched in stone, of engines roaring over dark water, and the moment when hope met fear at 60 feet above a black reservoir. If history is a river, then on that night a handful of men bent its course, not forever, but unmistakably. And though the war marched on, the world would never again doubt what courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice can do when they rise together in the night and refuse to turn back.